Hey everybody, welcome back to Chipstock Investor. Today we have a special episode on how you can calculate Google's $20 billion internet search payment to Apple for yourself. The reason we're talking about this is because we're nearing the end of the US Department of Justice's antitrust case alleging that there was anti-competitive activity and an unfair monopoly at Alphabet's Google search.
Yep, that's right. So these court proceedings began in September 2023. Final ruling against Google is expected later this year, maybe later this summer or in the early autumn. More importantly, though, any legal action, if any, which could include fines or maybe orders to change Google's business practices with, especially Apple, will commence following that ruling. Kasey, time really flies. We wrote almost 5 years ago now about this simmering talk of a Department of Justice lawsuit against big tech, especially Google. And this case sort of mirrors some past actions the Department of Justice has taken. A similar case taken against Microsoft all the way back in the late 1990s. And there's been a lot of investor worry about what this could mean for Google's bread and butter, the internet search feature, which hauls in still to this day most of the advertising revenue that makes up Alphabet's financial empire. And as you mentioned, in these court proceedings, it was revealed that Google paid $20 billion to Apple in 2022 to be the default search on Apple's iOS Safari web app. Now, that's not exactly breaking news, right? Not just because 2022 is the listed time frame, but again, time really flies. Almost 2 years ago, right in the middle of 2022, we wrote about how you could calculate in rough terms how much Google pays Apple every year for yourself. Here's the original link to that article and the paragraph you'd be looking for. And spoiler, at that time, before 2022 was even finished up, we wrote that the payment was on track to be upwards of $20 billion that Google was going to pay to Apple. This is obviously big business. Google pays a lot of money to Apple to get all of those iOS users using search so that they can generate ad revenue. And of course, Apple loves logging that really big annual payment that it gets from Google for the right to have internet search on iOS. But let's break it down so that you don't have to wait for news outlets to let you know years later what Google paid Apple. You can just figure it out because everything you need to get in the ballpark is already out there.
Let's start by looking at Google's traffic acquisition costs, or TAC. That's what Google pays to get user search traffic routed through Google Search. That's the starting point for this calculation. Alphabet reports TAC in all of its quarterly earnings reports. Let's use full year 2023 financials as an example, since 2022 has already been provided. Alphabet reported that Google's TAC was a whopping $50.8 billion in 2023. If Apple's mobile operating system is around 60% of US market share and close to 20% globally, of course, that is excluding China, where Google isn't able to be used. Estimates imply roughly 40%, which is the average of 60% and 20% of that TAC that Apple gets each year. We were showing you some slides from Counterpoint and IDC that can help you get a better understanding of Google's market share, which we'll link in our show notes that you can find on our Discord channel or over on our Ko-fi shop.
And that's pretty much all the information that you need. So if you add up the traffic acquisition costs, the TAC for Google from 2023, which was $50.8 billion, if you add up all 4 quarters, and then multiply it by that approximate 40% market share of Apple mobile devices, that gets you to roughly 20 to 21 billion in estimated TAC payments made to Apple in 2023. So perhaps just slightly more than the 20 billion noted in 2022. Do note, this is an approximation based on Apple smartphone shipment numbers as a percentage of total global smartphone sales. So Google's actual payment to Apple is likely a much more complex figure with various Apple products, for example, the iPhone versus the MacBook. as well as different geographies fetching a higher or lower dollar amount. For example, the US being more valuable than Europe, where there are stricter data privacy rules than the US. These figures and the general equation based on TAC gets us again in the ballpark. So the annual TAC multiplied by roughly 40% gets us to that 20 billion figure in 2022 and upwards of 21 billion that Google likely paid to Apple in 2023.
This story and the DOJ lawsuit at the heart of it has centered on Google's dominance as the internet search titan. However, this story really is and should be about Apple as well. Apple's total services revenue was $87.5 billion, or 23% of the $368 billion total in calendar year 2023. Therefore, we can imply somewhere between 20% and 25% of the services unit is made up of Google TAC, or about 5% of total revenue.
Yeah, this is really important because that Apple services segment is really important. It's been Apple's most consistent and highest growth area of business for years. And obviously, Google TAC is a very, very large outsized portion of it. And that TAC payment is likely a far above average profit center. And it's not just because this is software and apps that we're talking about, which is already inherently a high profit margin business. Apple doesn't have to do much extra work at all to set Google as the default search engine on the Safari web app before shipping off a device. So Apple's net income was $101 billion in 2023. So an outsized portion of that net income, upwards of 15% of Apple's net income, perhaps could be derived just from Google alone. So, Kasey, suffice to say, an unfavorable ruling against Google search could mean a really big negative impact on Apple's revenue and especially profit profile as well. We have a lot more discussion on this on business models in the tech world, and you can find more discussion on that and our show notes on this and everything else we do over on our Discord channel. You can access that again here on YouTube or over on our Ko-fi shop for just a $5 a month subscription.
All right, there you have it. We'll be back with more earnings coverage this weekend and later next week. If you have not subscribed to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's a free and easy way to support us. Take care, everyone. We'll see you again soon at Chipstock Investor.